Yesterday, First Nations and environmental groups launched a lawsuit to halt an LNG development by Petronas on BC's coast. Our guest says that one of the groups involved in that lawsuit, Skeena Wild, is heavily funded by donors from the United States. And she says that's true of many groups in Canada opposed to energy development. We are joined by Vivian Krause, researcher and columnist with the National Post. She's in Vancouver. Vivian, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Vivian, we can only, you've addressed complex issues, we can only scrape the surface, but if I could summarize your take in one important area here, you say that there's a campaign against Canadian energy development. A lot of it has been funded by US donors, big foundations, and you are concerned that it's not just environmentalism, that there's other motives going on. Could you set out your thesis for us?
Sure. Well, over the last 5 years, I've traced about $600 million that's come into Canada from American charitable foundations. Most of this money is for large conservation initiatives like the Great Bear Rainforest, the Canadian Boreal Initiative, the Yellowstone to Yukon Initiative. And of course, those are to protect wildlife and crucial habitat. But one of the objectives of those initiatives is also to stop the development of oil and gas in Canada by putting huge tracts of land off limits. And some of that money is specifically for anti-pipeline campaigns. Two organizations in particular are the intermediaries of this funding. One is the Tides Foundation in San Francisco. The other is the New Venture Fund in Washington, D.C. Tides, for example, has made more than 400 payments to about 100 environmental groups, totaling $35 million over the last 5 years. That's specifically for anti-pipeline activism.
Now, so let's cut to it here. I mean, you say that there's a campaign to keep Alberta, or Canadian Alberta oil mostly, landlocked, not let it get to tidewater. You feel there could be an economic motive behind this. Why? And you focus in on America's energy security. You say that's one of the objectives here. Can you explain what you mean?
Sure. Well, what I found is that the funders of this campaign have basically 4 goals. And actually, I think we can agree with them on 3 out of the 4. Those are increasing renewable energy, better energy efficiency, energy security. And so I think we can agree on all 3 of those. The 4th point, though, is where I think we should disagree, and that's that there's this multi-million-dollar campaign to stop the growth of the Canadian oil and natural gas industry. Meanwhile, there's no multi-million-dollar campaign against Texas or North Dakota or any of the states in the U.S. where, in recent years, oil production has boomed. And that's the inconsistency that I think we can object to.
Although we have just been looking at footage, they're trying to block that Dakota access pipeline. And we have seen objections to oil export terminals or energy export terminals in the States. Environmentalists have been active down there too.
Yes, but there's no systematic multi-million-dollar campaign with 400 payments. There's no hub coordinating it like there has been here in the last 5 years. Though we are seeing, you're right, Andrew, we are seeing now that the same groups that supported the anti-pipeline movement here in Canada are also supporting what's happening in south of us.
So are you essentially saying that the U.S. energy industry is funding this because they want to go on getting Canadian oil cheap? Oh, okay, thanks.
No, what I see is I've seen no evidence of commercial interest. In other words, I've found no evidence that a specific oil refinery is trying to keep a monopoly on its supply or anything like that. What I see are billionaire philanthropists who are concerned about the economic competitiveness of their own country. They're also concerned about energy security, and they want off foreign oil for the sake of the American economy.
And essentially keeping the Canadian oil for America's use and not letting us sell it to the world?
I think perhaps that's part of it. I think a big interest of these funders is energy independence. They don't want to be dependent particularly on oil from the Middle East. And of course, if you want to get off Mideast oil, you need to have a lockdown on Canadian oil.
Can we go back to the previous government, the government of Stephen Harper? You did a lot of work on the source of charities' funding, and also I believe you've done a lot of work on where charities environmentalists spend their money. Stephen Harper then brought in a law, or not a law, I'm sorry, directed the tax authorities to audit a lot of Canadian charitable groups. A lot of them said this was crippling. It involved them in heavy expense. Did you have any concern when that tax investigation was ordered?
Well, in 2010, I brought information to the attention of the CRA that had absolutely nothing to do with political activity nor pipelines. It was undue benefit to a director of a charity and what is called acting as a conduit. In other words, funneling money to organizations that are not eligible. And in fact, last year when the CRA issued its report on these audits, the CRA announced that 5 of them were to lose their charitable status. And the CRA also said they found no serious problems with political activity, which is what I had expected as well. But they did find exactly what had concerned me in the first place, which was undue benefits and other serious compliance issues. So I think it's important now to know what were the results of those audits. The five charities were not named. One of them, the one who was at the center of the controversy, is the Tides Canada Foundation. And they've since told me that they weren't even audited for political activity, but they were audited for something. And now that the results are in, they don't want to say what they were. So I think, given the influence that Tides has had in Canada, the impact of this campaign and of the other campaigns that organizations funded by Tides are running, the campaign for electoral reform, for instance, the campaign against CETA, and international trade agreements, I think it's not too much to ask Tides Canada to disclose the results of its CRA audit. If there's nothing to hide, then they can just make those results known.
Do these charities do a good job of disclosing where they get their money?
Not at all. No, they don't. In fact, all of my research is based on American tax returns. I've had to go to the US to read American tax returns to find out who's funding the environmental groups in Canada. If there's one thing I'd like to see, it's that Canada's disclosure requirements were simply brought in line with those of the United States, that the CRA would simply require the same disclosure as the IRS.
If we can look at your own source of funding, I know you've said you've done a lot of this off your own bat. I think you remortgaged your house, etc. at one stage. You have had some...
I sold it.
Okay, sold it. Sorry. But you have had some payments. I think one was at least $10,000 for speaking engagements with resource industry groups.
Well, Andrew, this is a point that's often brought up to discredit me. But the fact is, I was doing this research for about 5 years before there was any interest in it. And it wasn't until I had written a few articles for the Financial Post that I got a few invitations to speak at conferences. But the fact is, no one has ever funded my research. I've done that all of my own initiative and from my own home.
So what about the environmentalists? Have you sat down with them at all, or have you had any kind of dialogue with them?
Oh, I always write to them and ask, pose my questions first and foremost to them. And the only reason, in fact, that I started to write a blog is because I've been writing to Tides Canada for over 2 years, and they refused to answer any questions. At the time, I was trying to ask about, I think it was $8 million from American sources. Now that figure would be over $130 million. I think it's a fair question. Where's your money coming from? It's a fair question to ask of me as well.
Yeah, it certainly does sound fair on the surface. Now, I mean, some people might say, well, okay, these are tens of millions of dollars, but these global energy companies put tens of billions into Canada. These ecological groups, the environmental groups, are facing huge opponents there. They need all the help they get.
I think that's a fair point. But the trouble I see with this campaign is that it has an agenda, okay? The Tides Foundation, for example, reports to the IRS in its tax returns that it's funding research, education, and organizing. Now, if that's what they were actually funding, that would be fair. But in fact, in the covering letters on payments to these organizations, it says there that, in fact, Tides is funding organizations to build relationships with First Nations along the pipeline route, cultivate Indigenous opposition, and cultivate community opposition. That's not exactly research and education. This campaign deliberately seeks to stigmatize Canadian oil, to brand it as the poster child of dirty fuel. So, given that that's the objective, I think it's difficult for organizations that are involved in this campaign to play the role of honest broker. If Tides was funding them to play the role of honest broker, I think that would be fine. But that's not the agenda. So I think we need to know who's involved in this campaign.
Vivian, we'll have to leave it there. Fascinating stuff. I know we'll get a big reaction, and I hope you come back soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vivian Krause, researcher and columnist with the National Post, joined us from Vancouver. Now, we contacted Skeena Wild for a comment. Remember, they're one of the groups critical of that LNG decision. Here's what they told us. So far in 2016, 17.4% of our funding comes from Canadian donations and foundations, 83% or almost 83% from US foundations and individual donors. A wide variety of US philanthropic foundations support Skeena Wild's work.